That's weird.
I pressed the wrong button. Stuff happened. Anyway, back to Assistant to the Villain after a long hiatus, it feels like, because I've been getting distracted. Anyway, we're on chapter 20, if you need to know where we're at. That's where we're starting today. And Evie quit. Evie quit. Because the villain found Blade's letter on her person and thought it was hers. They had a bit of a tiff. The whole office was watching. Drama, am I right? Anyway, so she leaves
Drama.
and she's like, I quit. And she went home. And that's where we left off. So nobody's super happy. And Evie's afraid she might die because of the bargain that she made with the ink on her finger when she started her employment contract. So now we're picking back up with that knowledge on chapter 20. Everybody good to go? Got your stuff?
Yes.
Awesome.
My burrito stuck to the plate.
Man, I feel like I should have gotten tacos now instead of making ramen.
God, same.
All right. Chapter 20. The Villain. The next morning, Blade Gushikin's voice was laced with earnest amusement. I think you're going to wear a hole in the floor, boss. Tristan nearly took the man's head off. But he halted his pacing of his office floor, not caring for the nervous looks his employees were giving him through the doorway. Or did he care? He ran a hand through his hair. He couldn't think properly under these conditions. Without Sage, he'd had to go back to drinking his cauldron brew black, as Edwin thought he always did. The ogre had been his village's baker when Tristan was just a boy, and he was one of the only beings in this world Tristan really believed was all goodness. It's why Sage had to spend her mornings covertly adding sweetness to the brew. If Edwin found out Tristan didn't like the drink he'd worked so hard to develop, it might wound him. Caring about other people is very irritating. He thought of his assistant and began pacing around more. Tristan expected her to fly through the doors of his office that morning, a demure apology on her lips, and perhaps a pastry for him in hand. A sensible explanation for why she had that letter in the first place would follow, and all would go back to how it was. Tristan had spent the night clearing his head and was prepared to meet Sage's pleading with logical and fair judgment. After all, he'd been seconds away from telling her a secret that he'd scarcely spoken aloud to anyone. The worst of it was wanting to trust someone. If you remained indifferent, the fallible would never fail you and would remain safe. Tristan had wanted to trust her, and that was not Sage's fault, but his own. In addition to that problem, the office seemed to be going to shambles. Rebecca had reported 3 interns nearly brawling to death that morning because they'd been placed on the same cleaning crew in the dungeons. He hadn't been aware Sage knew the interns well enough to avoid skirmishes among them. Clever, but not clever enough to make him rethink her obvious transgressions. Then there'd been some sob story about one of the men's betrothed sleeping with his cousin, and Tristan had tuned out his humans and magical creatures resource manager before the melodrama rotted his brain. But that had only been the first issue of the day. It seemed that in the few months Sage had been here, she'd ingrained herself into nearly every moving wheel in his organization, like vines weaving through the foundation of a very old house, becoming a part of it. The villain had a fully functioning business before her, hadn't he? One would have no clue, since the sky seemed to be falling at nearly every point of the morning thus far. A weapons shipment came in, but only Sage, ever the note-taker in her gold-foiled journal, had any idea which shipment they had been expecting. It had taken 20 employees away from their current task to open every crate so they could catalog what was inside. Their magical filing cabinet, envy of all because of its ability to alphabetize any document that entered the enchanted space, had broken. The A's were where the X's should have been, and the L, M, N, O, and P files had simply been eaten by the wood. When Tristan had finally brought himself to ask if there was anyone who knew how to fix it, they replied as if they'd rehearsed it for his own torture. Miss Sage usually knows. He avoided Tatiana when he could, and for good reason, as the woman traded in office gossip. But an hour ago, Tristan had found himself feeling desperate to prove he was right to distrust his assistant, so he'd leaned into the healer's domain to ask if she'd heard anyone in the office sharing an incriminating secret with her about Sage. The healer had looked at him with such venomous disdain, Tristan thought she must have been poisoning him with her eyes. He felt like his whole body was burning. No, she replied flatly. I haven't. The villain had nodded and cleared his throat, and then left the healer's room feeling almost embarrassed. What a nightmare this was. And if everything wasn't already ripping apart at the seams, Blade was now occupying Tristan's attention with something he knew would turn his already sour mood into straight-up rotten. Don't you have a beast to tame? Tristan barked at Blade, praying to the gods that the dragon trainer would leave him to sulk. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Blade turned as Rebecca made her way to the villain's desk to set down another chalice of the foul, non-sugared brew. Good morning, Rebecca. It is, isn't it? She nodded happily, a wide smile spreading beneath her thick frames. Blade frowned at her back as she returned to her new desk right outside Tristan's office. The dragon tamer walked over and closed the door behind her before turning to Tristan again. I don't care how hard you need to beg, just do it. Please, that was terrifying. He shivered, like Miss Airing's happiness was a sign of an apocalyptic end. I don't beg for anything, the villain insisted, crossing his arms and noting his shirt didn't feel quite as soft as when Sage managed to launder hers. Today, his shirts were scratchy and irritating. Sage is the one who made the declaration and quit. She is the one who must apologize if I still allow her a position here after her obvious deceit with that letter. The dragon tamer stiffened, his hands fidgeting as his eyes darted toward the extra growth in Tristan's usually cleanly honed stubble on his chin. A rough night? Blade asked. I'll cut your tongue out, Tristan threatened. Right, Blade nodded. Fair. Before you do that, can you settle a matter for me? Tristan pinched the bridge of his nose, battling away a writhing headache. What? I, would like your permission to name the dragon. He narrowed his eyes in confusion. Did you not name him already? All the books say you're not supposed to name them until after they've completed the training, Blade insisted. And how reputable is this book you're taking such careful advice from? Oh, well, he chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his neck. I'm unsure, mostly because everything it's told me to do thus far seems to only anger or frighten the wits out of him. But I figure I'd be a little crabby too if I had nothing to call myself. I have a few things I'd like to call you. Tristan tried to add a threatening edge to his voice, but all his senses felt duller this morning, like he'd been in the dark for too long. Can you suggest a few for the dragon first? The hopeful look in the trainer's eyes reminded Tristan too much of someone he needed to stop thinking about before he sent a chair through the window. I don't know. Tristan paused, a strange thought coming over him. Fluffy. Name him Fluffy. Blade's head whipped backward, mouth falling slightly open. Fluffy? Sir? It's an adequate name, I'm told, he muttered defensively. Tristan didn't like the appraising look in the trainer's eyes. Now get out of my face, Gushkin. I'm very busy. Blade nodded, taking a step backward. Right away, sir. He spun toward the door, but stopped, his palm above the handle. The brawny man swallowed hard, then turned back to face Tristan, looking like he was about to lose his lunch. What? But Tristan never finished his sentence, because Blade's words were tumbling out so quick, several veins in the man's forehead began to pop. It was me, sir. The employment offer from King Benedict, it was mine. Tristan froze, idly wondering how his heart could be pounding in his chest when his blood had turned to ice. Explain. He bit out, the words so clipped and cold he watched Blade shiver. Gushikin stepped forward, pushing his shoulders back, clearly trying to summon bravery. His stories spilled out in waves, and Tristan didn't speak until he knew the dragon trainer had finished. Blade spoke of his childhood, the kingdom's capital, his father's political career on Renadon's council, Blade's affinity for animals and magical creatures, how he'd only kept the letter to himself to remind himself that he'd made the right choice coming here. Tristan's body went taut when Blade's story pulled in Evie. While Blade spoke, Tristan kept his face impassive, but his mind was racing, adrenaline pumping through him. She kept the letter to make sure I fessed up. She gave me the chance to tell you myself because she is kind and a good friend. But make no mistake, sir, she is completely loyal to you. This whole thing is all my fault. If you want to fire me or, murder me, I completely understand. I wanted to give someone else the chance to tell you first. Sage's voice cut through the pounding blackness that was feeding into the villain's mind like a rainbow slicing through the endings of a vicious storm. I should say thank you for proving even promised trust can be broken. Sage had stumbled backward like he'd struck her, because he had. But the villain had been far too stubborn, too triggered by his past betrayals to see anything but his own hurt. Tristan had called her a hypocrite when it was becoming glaringly obvious the only person guilty of hypocrisy was himself. She had wanted him to have enough faith in her, to trust her, and instead he'd punished her. Tristan held Blade's gaze. You should not have kept this from me, Gushikin. Blade nodded, ducking his head. If I had known the trouble it would cause, believe me, I wouldn't have. Believe you? Something dark was creeping into Tristan's voice as he begrudgingly realized what it felt like to be wrong. It felt horrible. I don't know what to believe right now, but believe this: if you ever find yourself lying to me again or implicating another employee because of your carelessness, you will find your head adorning my rafters. Blade looked queasy, and Tristan resisted the urge to chuck the man through the window. Gushikin waved both hands in front of his face. No, I promise to never keep a secret from you again, sir. I will head to the healer now to have a magical oath burned into my flesh, in fact. And with that, Blade turned to take off towards Tatiana's quarters. As he pulled the door open, he sheepishly glanced back at the villain, something vulnerable in the man's expression. Sir, does this mean I can keep my job? That the dragon and I can remain? It wasn't mercy, what Tristan said next, but it was alarmingly close to it. Yes. Against my better judgment, you may remain. Thank you, sir, Blade said, his voice far away as Tristan had already moved toward a stained glass window, unlatching the glass and pushing it open to let the summer air waft over him. The sunlight hit his face, but he felt no warmth. like Sage had dragged even the power of the sun away with her. He hadn't realized the dragon tamer was still standing in his office until Tristan heard him ask a question so small and quiet, he nearly missed it. Sir? What about Evie? When Tristan remained silent, he heard Blade's footsteps fade away until they were gone completely. But the dragon trainer's question echoed through his mind so many times, Tristan wanted to scratch it out. What about Evie? Time.
It is 47. Take 47.
Sick. Chapter 21. Evie. Evie always knew she'd die at the hands of her own foolishness. She'd landed herself in far too many dangerous situations, unintentionally, for the odds to not fall against her at some point in time. She'd straddled her boss and then quit her job all in one day. Groaning into her hands, she rolled over in her bed, ignoring Lissa when she hesitantly nudged the door open. I have to go to school. She lightly placed something on the shelf beside Evie's bed. I made you some tea that always helps Papa when he's feeling sick. Flipping over immediately to face her sister, Evie rushed to assure her that she was not unwell, desperate to get rid of the forlorn look in her sister's expression. It's okay, Lissa, I promise. I'm not sick the way Papa is. Her sister's shoulders relaxed. What kind of sickness is it then? You never miss work. Evie tapped her chest with her palm, feeling the lump in her throat moving to sit underneath her hand. It's a sick feeling here, in my heart. It was difficult to decipher her feelings on her own, let alone attempt to explain them to a 10-year-old. Oh, you're sad, her sister said, nodding. Well, she waited, considering the words. Actually, yes, I suppose that sums it up pretty nicely. You use too many words to say simple things, Evie. Her sister patted her head before grabbing a book she'd placed on the ground. You should only use a couple. People understand better that way. Smiling and feeling a little lighter, Evie got out of bed and waved her sister off. She watched out the window as Lissa ran in the direction of her school. Then she padded barefoot across the kitchen floor and pulled the spigot to get a cup of water. She looked down to the employer's bargain on her pinky finger, narrowing her eyes at it. She'd expected some sort of recourse for disobeying the promise. After all, she'd quit. Where was her reckoning? Or was it a slow death? Was she going... Would she be going about her day and then suddenly her heart would stop? She'd have to fix it, or Lissa would be left all alone, and... A rasping cough came from behind her, causing her to jump and spill her cup on the floor. I'm sorry, her father rasped again, collapsing hard into the chair, face pale and drawn. I didn't mean to frighten you. Papa! She moved to his side, crouching before him. Have you been taking the medicine my friend made special for you? He smiled guiltily, taking a shaky hand to his forehead to dab off the sweat there. I didn't think I needed it. I've been feeling so much better. Evie shook her head, trying not to chastise him. Her father didn't always do well to give care where he should. After Gideon died and her mother departed soon after, Evie's father had fallen into such despair he couldn't bring himself to even hold Lissa. They'd decided as a family that Evie would continue her education at home, away from the schoolhouse and all her friends, to assist in raising her little sister. A sacrificed childhood was a small penance for how Evie had failed her family, her mother, Gideon. She wondered if that was why she could be so impulsive, so headstrong. Every childish part of her should have had the chance to change and grow, but instead it was stifled, like a flower cut right as it was about to bloom. Her father's eyes suddenly widened, and he attempted to stand on shaky legs. Lisa's still here. I don't want to frighten her. She's been so happy seeing me so well. She's off to school already, Evie assured him. She moved his arm over her shoulder and walked him back to his bedroom. Papa, you need to take better care of yourself, if not for your own sake, then for Lisa's. Evie helped him gently onto the bed, pulling the covers up under his chin, then reached into the drawer of his dresser. Quickly finding the small vial of medicine, she measured out a few drops. Open, she commanded. After the medicine had a few minutes to make its way through his system, her father's eyes began to close. Why aren't you at work today, dear one? Evie pulled the knitted blanket off of the cushioned armchair beside her father's bed and draped it around her waist as she sat down. I had a fight with my boss, she said, pleased to be able to share at least an ounce of honesty with her father. His mouth pinched. Whatever it is, I'm sure it wasn't all that bad. Smiling at her, he continued, Perhaps you might go and apologize. Evie tried to ignore the sting that her father assumed it was she who did something wrong. I don't think that would help the situation very much, unfortunately. He gave her a dubious look, his eyes beginning to droop again. If you want an old man's advice, be honest. Clearing his throat once more and placing a hand on his chest, her father got a faraway look in his eyes. There is so much that can be fixed by honesty, if you're brave enough to use it. It's something I wish I had been more with your mother. The mention of Nora surprised Evie. You never talk about Mama. Her father smiled sadly at her, causing a dull ache to build in her chest. It is painful, even now, to think of what your mother did to your brother. What she could have done to you and Lisa. I don't think she meant to hurt us that day, Papa. After her mother had given birth to Lissa, their mother's magic awoke in a flurry of divine light. Nora Sage had been blessed by the gods with the power of starlight, a magic so pure and rare when the magical specialist came to assess her, he'd brought tidings of joy from King Benedict himself. But what was supposed to be a divine blessing became their family's very downfall. The months that followed Lissa's birth were filled with unending sadness. Their mother's magic seemed to drain every ounce of life from her. Even the color in Nora Sage's cheeks had disappeared. Evie's father had urged her to distract her mother, lighten her load. Gideon had needed to focus on his schoolwork, something Evie would have liked to do as well, but Gideon hadn't known that. He was the sort of brother who would give you his toy if he saw you wanted to play with it. Evie knew he'd give up too much for her if she asked, so she never did. And then everything got worse. I hate even thinking of that day. Her father's face twisted into a bitter expression before relaxing. I was working when your mother dragged you three to the dandelion fields, and I regret going in early that morning every day of my life. Evie's mother had Lissa in a sling around her neck the day she finally got out of bed. Her eyes had been crazed, but she looked alive. It was why Evie and Gideon had agreed to go on a morning stroll with her, to what had been their favorite spot before Lissa was born. Her mother had looked so beautiful. Her bronze skin glistened against the rising sun, her eyes lined with kohl and lips rouged with red. She wanted to play with her magic, that was all, Evie said so quietly it was practically a whisper. Their mother had made the dandelions glow, had made the light move like the plants moved with it. She'd held a ball of starlight in her hand and begged Gideon to go catch it. Evie had watched her brother run past the field, seeing too late that the small ball of light was getting larger and larger Nobody knew what was happening until Gideon's screams enveloped the field and scorched ground took his place. "She murdered your brother, Evie," her father said with a ferocity that made her want to cower. She had. It hadn't been on purpose, Evie was sure of it. But it happened. He died right there, and Evie had collapsed to the ground in a fit of shocked screams. She'd gripped the ground with both hands, not looking up until she'd heard Lissa's cries. Her baby sister had been set beside her in the sling from her mother's neck, and her mother was gone. Closing her eyes tight, Evie sighed out a heavy breath, willing her heart free from the vice it was currently in. "Do you hate her, Papa?" A singular tear rolled down her father's rough cheek. "Some days I wish I did." He pulled the medallion from the inside of his shirt and rubbed it between his fingers. "She gave me this when we first met. I keep it close because, despite myself, I miss her." "I do too sometimes." She missed her mother's laugh and the way the house always felt warmer with her inside it, but mostly she just missed the before. Before life became harsher, before circumstances grew desperate, before Evie had irrevocably changed. Who was she before the last 10 years? Her father seemed to be contemplating the same question. But it's also a reminder, Evie, to protect your heart, for it so easily can be broken. Thoughts of Tristan, the villain, clouded her mind. She wondered how long she would have kept the secret if she hadn't quit. Wondered how many times she could look at the people she cherished most in this world and deceive them. It reminded Evie of a vase Lissa had knocked off the windowsill a few years prior, how the two Sage daughters had sat side by side, gluing the pieces back together. But that effort had been useless in the end. A month or two after that, Evie bumped into it, knocking it over once more, shattering it a second time. "Can we fix it?" Lissa had asked. "With the paste?" "No, love," Evie had sighed. "It's hard enough to put something back together once. A second time, I'm afraid, is far too much to hope for." They'd thrown the pieces away. Her head and heart fixated on that moment until her breathing grew shallow and sweat stuck to her hairline. Too many lies. It was one thing to be living a double life, but another altogether where she wasn't trusted, as if her opinions and her confidence weren't worthy. Constantly fighting for a place, one that feels important, was the single most exhausting task Evie had ever given herself. And she was exhausted. She felt it in the ache of her limbs and the weight of her eyelids as she laid back against the comfortable chair and closed her eyes. Sometime later, the sound of her father's groans startled Evie awake. She bolted from her seat and leaned over him. His eyes were closed, and his complexion was dull and colorless. "Papa?" "Worry not. It hasn't taken me yet." Her father smiled lightly, opening his light blue eyes. "That isn't funny, Papa." They both laughed anyway, and Evie reached for his hand, bringing it up to kiss the back of it. Her father was strong. After her brother died and her mother left, he did his best to keep busy at the butchery, ensuring that his remaining two children never wanted for anything. They saw less of him at home, but that had been fine. He'd hired a private tutor for Evie so she could stay away from the school and avoid conversing with the other girls in her village who reminded her of her past. Girls Evie no longer seemed to have anything in common with. Tragedy did that to a family, isolated them. Her father seemed the only one who still felt comfortable among the living, his many friends in the village by his side, comforting him in the months and years to come. As for Evie, She had been content to live with the ghost. Lissa had grown up to be a social butterfly, enchanting every person she set her eyes on, untouched by the tragedy she witnessed as an infant, and Evie had remained just as she was. Odd. Always saying the wrong things, her mind and thoughts not built for polite company. It caused Evie such pinched worry with every interaction that she'd eventually stopped trying, had stopped living. It had only worsened when her father grew ill, more of an excuse to bury herself in a job than actually letting herself be a person. Up until she had begun working for the villain. It was ironic that a man who'd built so much death seemed to have brought her back to life, but now it was over. Evie would slowly regress backward until every part of her burned to ash, like blackened dandelions. Tears burned, but Evie blinked them back and smiled wide for her father. "Everything's all right," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken to Lissa in that field of burned-up wishes all those years ago. Everything was all right. Time.
9:02.
Thank you. Chapter 22. The Villain. "What in the Deadlands is this?" The small man shook as he took cautious steps away from Tristan's desk. It's cauldron brew, sir." He gripped the silver chalice containing the foul black liquid. No cream, no sugar, none of Sage's ridiculous attempts to make faces with the milk. It was all wrong. "I did not ask for cauldron brew," he said darkly. Of course, sir, but you did say to me 10 minutes ago, 'Get me a cup of cauldron brew immediately, Stuart, or I will rip the skin from your bones.'" Ah, yes, he had said that, hadn't he? He thought he'd forego the brew until he could sneak some milk into it, but by noon he had a splitting headache and had grown desperate. "I do not want this swill. Take it from my sight this instant." He stood, shoving the cup at the terrified man, who just barely caught it before he scurried from the room. Tristan spared a glance at Kingsley. The frog riveted as he held up a sign that simply read, "Blockhead." For once, the frog summed things up perfectly. Ignoring the amphibian, Tristan settled back behind his desk to focus on his evil-doing plans. Surely thoughts of mayhem and destruction would calm his sour mood. By the afternoon, Tristan was surprised the office was still standing. A fire had started in the south quarter of the manor, and it nearly burned an entire room of charted maps to ash. It started as two of the fire pixies had a disagreement that ended in fast-spreading flames, and only Sage knew where to find the irrigation devices she'd insisted they install during her first month of employment. "You'll never see them," Sage had said, curls bouncing with her excitement at the water fixture installation. She'd pushed the hose made of some material she'd insisted he invest in called rubber back into the wall. The mechanism locked in place, the rubber tubing flipping and disappearing behind the white bricks. "They're hidden all over the manor. When you have a structure this big, it's important that you account for fires, especially with all the lives in your care." She'd smiled and pulled her notebook from her satchel. "Now, I've mapped out where all 30 of them are, and I'll take you to each spot so you know exactly how to find them." 30. Sage, as delightful as a tour of hoses, sounds I have actual work to do. She'd frowned, which had given him a foreign, uncomfortable feeling in his chest. "But what will you do if there's a fire?" "I'll ask you where the hose is," Tristan had replied flatly. Sage's nose had scrunched as it so often did, and she looked at him with a curiosity that was almost endearing. He shuddered. But what will you do if I'm not here? She'd asked. You'll always be here, Sage. Tristan blinked, feeling a sting under his eyes. He strode through his office and pushed open the wooden doors that led out to the damaged parapet. The doors slammed closed behind him, and he blinked back, the wet heat in the air. The structure on the other side was covered and propped up by wooden beams that were aiding the reconstruction being done. He stopped just short of the ruined end, the heat of the air burning his eyes again. He'd resolved to not care that she was gone. He wouldn't dare go after her, and she wouldn't dare return here after the cruel way in which he'd spoken to her. The heat was relentless now, the moisture so strong a drop of water was sliding down his cheek. He furiously swiped it away and looked at the wetness on his hand with disgust. Sir. Miss Airing's voice cut through the quiet, making the wet heat hitting his eyes dry in seconds. Sniffling like he'd smelled something foul, Tristan frowned, turning his head slightly towards her. What's wrong now? He asked gruffly. The woman was always a little pinched, but right now her face was so twisted, it looked as if she were about to swallow her own tongue. She shook her head, her large glasses sliding down her nose. One of the men you have working through the manor's finances is up in arms because he can't read the appraiser's handwriting. Tristan furrowed his brow in confusion. What exactly was the appraiser valuing? Several crates of jewels that had been en route to King Benedict, aid from Rosalia, one of the northern kingdoms. It was intercepted by the malevolent guards this morning. What a brilliant plan. Pity he had no memory of creating it. Who on earth arranged for that? The northern kingdoms usually have their shipments travel with an army's worth of guards. Miss Airing's mouth pulled down, but she looked at him directly when she said, Evangelina had the plan drawn up a month ago, and you signed off on them, sir. No, that couldn't be. But he hadn't he? Sage had proposed that some of the malevolent guards wear Rosalia uniforms, slowly working their way through the throng of them and plucking the real Rosalia knights off one by one. It was suicide, but she'd seemed so sure. So he'd signed off on the plan, requiring that some of his best guards carry it out. No need to send the novices to an early demise. At least his more seasoned guards would have a chance of making it out. But they hadn't just made it out, they'd succeeded. Well, that is excellent, but I'm still not understanding the conflict. Why can't our financial advisor read the appraiser's handwriting? Rebecca Airing, in the 2 years he'd known her, had never been without her armor of composure. Even when he'd first met her, under those unpleasant circumstances, she'd remained impassive. But she surprised Tristan when she rolled her eyes at him. The handwriting is atrocious, sir. It would take a translator to make out even one letter of that scroll. His patience was so thin it may as well have been the ground beneath his feet. Well, how did we manage to make it out before? But he knew the answer before the uncomfortable look fell across her face. Evie could always read it without any problems, she said. Edwin used to give her pastries while she did it. By her tone, the stern woman didn't approve of the latter. Tristan could hardly bring himself to care, however. He was currently coming to grips with the fact that he simply did not have an office without Sage. Or, you suppose he did, but it was frankly an ill-functioning disaster. The righteous emotions from that morning had turned and mutated into what it really was all along. A way for his brain to rationalize his regret. He truly hated being wrong, but he supposed if he'd defer being right to anyone, it was to Sage, who would probably never take another step towards this place, which meant he had to go to her. Tristan tried not to let his turmoil show in his words as he looked at Miss Airing and said, Have the finance men put them aside, and I will do my best to translate the handwriting myself. She nodded and turned to leave, but before she did, she looked to the ruins at the end of the parapet. Isn't it interesting that we are quicker to repair some things over others? There was an accusation there that made Tristan narrow his eyes at her. What are you implying, Miss Erring? He noted the sharp edge to his voice, but to Rebecca's credit, she pulled herself up straight, not wavering for a moment. That perhaps you need to remove your pride so that you can see what needs to be fixed more clearly. It was the boldness with which she spoke that made Tristan respect her. Rebecca Erring was without fear when she believed herself to be right. It was that respect that saved her. You should mind your own problems before mine, Miss Erring. My employees are yours to counsel. I, however, am not. She nodded dutifully, the snap of fright, a fight winking out of her in a moment, and it confused him. Rebecca Erring was implying that Sage leaving the job was something that needed to be fixed. Tristan had been certain the feud between them had been quite mutual. Miss Erring, do you want Miss Sage to come back? He asked curiously. She didn't look at him, just gave him her back as she turned to open the heavy door. No, I don't, she said quietly. But I think she deserves to. The words were so flat and honest that Tristan leaned against the stone half-wall, the slam of the door as the woman left a dull, faded sound in his ears. He brushed a heavy hand over his mouth and down until it was resting under his chin. He looked to the wreckage one more time before returning to his office. Fix it. Unfortunately, Tristan didn't have the skills to fix anything. He was much better at destroying everything he touched, which was why he doubted by the end of this awful day that even the manor would still remain standing when he was done. Time.
At 13.
Chapter 23. The Villain. A soft knock on the door of Tristan's office was his final straw. It was nearly an hour until the day concluded, and he couldn't wait for the sun to go down and the day to turn to night. He wanted to drown in it. Pushing back from his chair, he walked over and looked out the window. He nearly bursted out of his skin when he heard the door creep open anyway. Unless there is another fire, I do not want to be disturbed, he called out harshly. The darker magic within him pulsed, aching to find a weak spot and destroy whoever dared enter his domain uninvited. I blew up half the parapet last week. Every part of him went stiff as a board, and yet a deep, intrinsic part of him relaxed as the voice continued. Does that count? Turning, needing to catch sight of her, he froze as an uncomfortable feeling fluttered in his chest. He shoved his hands into the front pockets of his breeches and stared at her. His former assistant looked the same, still short, still dark-haired, still with eyes that seemed to know too much and lips that were constantly pulling up at the corners. He went longer than this on the weekend when he didn't see her, so the reaction his body was having was ridiculous. But he was so happy to see her. What an obscene, unnecessary emotion, but there it was. He was happy. How positively vile. And the lightness in his chest only grew when she began to speak. I don't like feeling as if I can't do something. The words tumbled out of her mouth, not practiced, but honest. All right, he said neutrally. It makes me irrational. It's like it triggers something in me that... Stop. He held a hand up to interrupt her, looking over her shoulder to the open door. Hold that thought. He moved swiftly toward it, noting the crowd of onlookers trying to peek around the doorway, all dispersing when he glared. All but Blade, who wandered by with yet another bandage on his head, noticing Sage and turning back to Tristan with a small fist bump. Tristan flipped him off before closing the door and turning to Kingsley, who sat unmoving on his desk. At least he wasn't holding up his earlier sign again. Could you be anywhere else? Tristan asked, and when the creature hopped off the desk and over 2 feet to land on the windowsill, he sighed and then looked to Sage. Proceed. I know. There are things you don't want to trust me with. I even know there are things that I just can't accomplish. He fiercely doubted that, but didn't say anything. She moved to her regular seat. He chose to remain standing, leaning against his desk. But not being able to take care of what I need to, of the people I need to, it terrifies me. His curiosity was piqued as his brows shot up in surprise. Surely this woman didn't really believe herself incapable of anything. Besides, she knew his overreaction and treatment of her was wrong, that he'd been wrong about the letter. So why was she explaining herself? I know that I can't know everything, and I respect it. You're a man with many secrets. Unlike me. She laughed a little at the end, the self-deprecating kind. He knew it well. She continued, her light eyes finding his dark ones, and Tristan flexed his hands nervously at his sides to alleviate the almost ticklish feeling spreading through his limbs. But when you accused me of being deceitful, Tristan's shoulders straightened. It hurt me. You didn't even give me the chance to explain. It hurt me. He wondered if it would scar her for her life if he threw himself from the window. However, she paused. I shouldn't have quit so abruptly. My emotions got the better of me, and it was not a decision I would have made had I given myself the opportunity to process that hurt appropriately. She took a deep breath. Her gaze remained steady on him. For that, I sincerely apologize and ask you to allow me my job back. A silence echoed as they stared at each other. Tristan realized his lips had parted as she was speaking, and he was currently gaping at her like a deranged fish. Swallowing, he moved his jaw back and forth, trying to ease the stiffness. You want to come back. The eagerness in his voice needed to be squashed under his boot like a roach. She nodded, eyes glinting as the last dregs of sunlight spilled in. I really love working here. He should leave it there. Both of them acknowledging he was in the right, that she had been absurd in letting the pieces of their lives fall back together unencumbered. It hurt me. Guilt. He was feeling guilt in a harsh, raw way, and he couldn't stand it. To see her sitting there looking open and reasonable, a courageous hope surrounding her, it grated against his skin, causing a pounding in the front of his skull. Tristan found his chair and sat slowly, not letting another moment of silence step in. Sage, Tatiana must have poisoned his brew. That's what it was. It was the only explanation for the feeling when he looked at her. It had to be. Tristan's distress only kept growing when he looked over to Kingsley, who was holding up a sign from across the room that said, Speak. He stood abruptly again, and they both jumped, Sage quickly standing too. He walked slowly around the desk, eyes never leaving hers. He wondered if there was a word for when you know you're going to fail at something. One word to define that feeling where you know no matter how hard you resist that path, it will find you. Evangelina Sage had found him. I'm sorry. The apology came out fast, and he was almost certain his voice went up an octave, which was not only mortifying, but enough to make him want to consider the window idea again. You're sorry? Sage's jaw hung so low, Tristan wondered if it would catch the dirt from the ground. Dispense with the dramatics. It's not as if I told you I have a nightlight. Sage's gaze sharpened at his words, and Tristan cursed under his breath. Her wicked eyes gave her away as she rubbed her chin like one of the older magical specialists. Sir, do you have a nightlight? Tristan shook his head and rubbed at his eyes with the backs of his hand, mumbling, I don't not have one. The giggle she let out was loud and at a pitch that should call the birds to the window, looking for their brethren, but it was adorable, and he hoped she would do it again. Fuck. You have a nightlight? For what? Does it burn insects, trying to lure something to its death? Her words were coming out so quick her mouth could barely keep up. He sighed and shook his head, taking this as his penance. I use a nightlight for the purpose it was assigned, to make the night lighter. He winced. Gods, that sounded ridiculous. This is the best day of my life! Sage's nose scrunched, and she chuckled as she began her little bounce of excitement, like her laughter was going to launch her into the sun. Why do you need to light the night? She mimicked his voice. Placing one hand on his hip and another against his forehead, Tristan felt exhausted. I find myself fearful of the dark, particularly when I'm alone, or in my bedchamber, or both. Sage's jaw seemed to find the floor again, shocked into silence. Concerning. Tristan bristled. Is that a problem? No, of course it's not, she said, amusement dwindling into softness. How long have you been afraid of the dark? I am not afraid of the dark, Sage. I am the villain. The dark fears me. He let his chest puff out to prove his point, which only made her giggle again. My apologies, sir, she said contritely. How long have you been afraid of the dark, particularly in your bedchamber? The last part, she deepened her voice again to sound like his. Since I was a child, he admitted, but didn't mention how it had worsened over the years or why. She must have sensed it, though, because she reached out a hand and placed it on his. He stiffened at the touch, the way he always did with human contact, his head whipping down to look at her small hand laying over his. I'm afraid of ladybugs, she said, nodding seriously. Tristan gawked openly, looking to the ceiling, wondering how on earth he'd gotten here, apologizing to an employee, badly, he might add, because somehow the conversation had been diverted to insects. When he didn't say anything, she added, The spots scare me. Of course they do, he said defeatedly. Sage, I was attempting an apology. Oh, right, sorry, go on. She looked embarrassed as she took a step back and gestured her hands forward for him to go on. Sighing, he continued. You have done nothing that would indicate to me you're incapable or unworthy of my trust. I overreacted to the letter, and it was very unfair of me. She interrupted quickly. The letter wasn't. I know, Tristan said, holding up a hand to stop her. Blade told me. Sage's mouth pulled down in a frown. Sir, you didn't. That is to say, is Blade still breathing? See, the way I've seen you torture the men you drag through here, that somehow doesn't make me feel better, she said blandly. He's alive, unharmed, and still has a job. Tristan didn't want to continue speaking of his previous mercy as it made him feel ill. He quickly added, "As do you, if you would like to start over again." The already uplifted corners of her mouth pulled up higher, lighting her entire face. It made his rigid limbs feel softer, like she was liquefying his bones. Stepping towards him, Sage held out her hand. Hesitating just a moment, the villain clasped Sage's hand in his. "My name is Evangelina Sage. A pleasure to meet you. Shall I call you Sir or Evil Overlord?" Shaking his head, he pulled in a grin, and Sage's eyes darted to his left cheek, looking pleased. The woman was unnaturally obsessed with his dimple. "I will allow either if you go get me one of those fried things from the kitchen and a chalice of sugary cauldron brew." "Sold!" she screeched, nearly tripping over her own feet to get to the door. "Sage!" Tristan called, immediately regretting it when she turned, looking at him expectantly. "I just want to understand. Why is it that you want my trust in the first place?" She leaned a hand against her cheek, and one eyebrow rose thoughtfully. "I want to know you, that's all." That's all. Like that sentence alone wasn't enough to knock him completely off his axis. Sage disappeared through the doors, and Tristan leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, arms resting on his knees. "I want to know you." Tristan felt unfettered fear as he sat there, because for the first time in a decade, the idea of that didn't sound so very bad. And yet, he somehow knew in his bones she was going to be the death of him, eventually. Time.
9:29.
Thank you. Chapter 24. Evie. Things were far too quiet. The last week and a half of work had settled back into its average, steady rhythm. The boss dragging bedraggled men through here by their ears, still for reasons unknown to her. 2 imports of weapons and other stolen goods were passed from Rosalia to the manor without a single hitch. Their office informant was slipping. Evie was enjoying a vanilla drop, standing at the kitchen window she loved so much, which she hadn't had many opportunities to visit as of late. It didn't hurt that Edwin had just made a fresh batch of fairy cakes, all iced to perfection. She was enjoying catching up until Becky ruined it. Must be nice to act completely unprofessional and be welcomed back like nothing happened. Evie's eyes rolled back in her head. She looked at Becky, who was standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Must be nice to be a judgmental shrew and have that excuse as a facet of your personality. Evie smiled cheekily. Smirking, moving over to the steaming cauldron, Becky held out her chalice for Edwin to fill. The ogre was twice her size and wouldn't make eye contact with her. Better a judgmental shrew than a naive fool who's always getting herself into trouble. Evie's eye was beginning to twitch. Don't you have somewhere to be? Like stealing sweets from children, perhaps? Narrowing her eyes, Becky gripped her hot drink and stalked from the room, her skirts bouncing as she walked. Blade jumped out of her path like his life was on the line as he entered the kitchen and walked towards Evie, all the while keeping his head turned and his eyes on Becky, moving swiftly in the other direction. He grinned wide. She was damn unpleasant when you were gone. So glad to see her coming back to herself. Unlikely. Oh, yes, because she's just been an absolute delight all week long. Evie shuffled back over to her desk, brew in hand, and Blade followed at her heels. Forget lovely Rebecca, I have something amazing I want to show you. Blade grinned, the white against his tan skin giving him a glow of health and vigor. Can the boss spare you for 20 minutes? I'm sure he won't mind, considering he's not at the manor today. Sighing, she ignored the pinch of worry. What is it? Just come, he urged, grabbing her hand and pulling her along. Tatiana appeared beside them, a bored expression on her face. Where are we going? It's been slow. No interns to patch up? Evie inquired as the three of them began to descend the stairs. Or the boss's sister to tend to? She grinned wide when Tatiana lightly shoved her. The boss's who? Blade asked, eyebrows raised. Wrapping a muscled arm around Tatiana's shoulders, Blade leaned in close. Share with the class. I love gossip. I didn't come along on this little excursion to get interrogated, only entertained. Evie raised her hand in the air. I'm pretty entertained. She lowered her hand when she caught the look Tatiana was skewering them with. They walked into the courtyard, and the excitement was pulsating off Blade in waves. Wait till you see the progress Fluffy and I have made. Leaps and bounds over everything else we've been trying for months. Both women stopped short in the entryway, exchanging a look of startled confusion. Did you say Fluffy? Evie asked. Blade chuckled to himself. I know, but believe me when I say, Boss! Evie's heart thundered, and she became achingly aware of a formidable presence hovering behind her. Her suspicions were confirmed when she heard a low voice far too close to her ear. Are you cutting out in the middle of the workday, you ingrates? There was no anger behind his voice, just worry exhaustion. Evie turned to see him standing right behind her, his expression grim, dark circles under his eyes. Blade has something he wanted us to see. Pausing, Evie raised a hand and rubbed a finger lightly over one of the dark patches. She and the villain must have been equally shocked by her boldness because neither of them moved. Have you been sleeping? Tatiana raised a brow, smirking, and Blade seemed to find something very interesting about his shoes. Sleep is hardly a concern, the villain said, eventually grabbing her hand and pushing it back to her side. She might have imagined his fingers lingered on hers a second longer than necessary. Evie propped a hand on her hip. You're not a machine, sir. You can still be your evil, brooding self with a good night's rest. I don't know. I think the tired look gives him a menacing edge. Blade nodded, patting the villain on the shoulder, then quickly pulling his hand back to his side when he saw the eviscerating look he got as a result. I think it just makes him look sleepy, Tatiana said flatly, angling her head for a better view. Could we possibly desist with discussing my nocturnal habits so you three can start explaining why my supposedly respectable employees are away from their posts? He raised a brow, crossing his arms as he waited for an explanation. Blade opened his mouth but froze when wind whipped against the back gate. Turning his head, a wide grin split his lips. Hear that? The weather? The villain asked sardonically. The wind whipped against the door, harsher this time. The rattling caused Tatiana and her to jump, and for the villain to grab Evie and yank her behind him. What in the Deadlands was that? He growled. Blade strutted to the back gate, sweeping one arm out as though introducing King Benedict. That, my dear friends, was Fluffy. Time. 9:36.
Fluffy, like three-headed dog Hagrid Fluffy?
Yeah.
Yay!
Well, dragon.
Oh, even better.
Dragon, not dog.
Even better. Dragons don't shed everywhere.
Chapter 25. The villain. The villain's pulse pounded in his ears when he felt Sage's keen eyes on him. Clearing his throat, he slowly turned to her, but she was already walking past him, arm in arm with Tatiana. The healer called out with an astonished expression. "Why would you name the poor animal that?" Blade's gaze darted to his, and Tristan narrowed his eyes on the man. He better not share. "Oh, it was just the silliest thing I could think of. A bit of revenge for all the trouble he's caused me." And the perfect example of the exact wrong thing to say. Excellent. He almost wished the man had just admitted Tristan had suggested the name, given the way Sage's shoulders stiffened. She released Tatiana's arm and marched into the courtyard, the healer right at her heels. "How dare you name the poor creature out of spite, Blade Gushkin?" The dragon trainer looked guilty at the reprimand. Tristan followed behind them, feeling like a unicorn's ass. The back courtyard was one of his favorite areas in the manor. The large space was covered in stone, with clumps of grass and plants coming up through the cracks. The stone archways had suffered since the creature had begun to grow, throwing daily fits as he knocked his chained neck into everything around him. Unlike now, as he realized the creature seemed eerily calm. Too calm. "Where is his chain?" the villain asked, trying to keep himself level with the fire-breathing beast, who was staring right into Sage's eyes, nostrils flaring. Tristan felt his power move over him like a dark cloud, changing his vision so that all he could see were vulnerable kill spots on the dragon's scaled skin. On the left side of a clawed foot, there was a weak point. If he struck it just right, the dragon would topple over onto the ground, paralyzed forever. But he caught the marks from the chains around the creature's neck, which glowed with scarred-over wounds. That gave him pause. His power receded back into himself, just as Sage reached a shaky hand up to the beast. "Sage," he whispered into the ghostly quiet. "I wouldn't." But she kept looking at the creature in wonder, whispering, "Hey, dragon," flinching slightly when the creature gave a huff. "It's okay," Gushikin assured. "After I started calling him by name, he calmed down. He's as harmless as a house cat." "A house cat with wings that breathes fire," Tatiana corrected, taking a careful step away from Fluffy. Removing the chain likely helped more. The villain walked closer to the beast, subtly placing himself between him and Sage. "I'm sure that quelled him. I wasn't aware." He felt guilt squeeze his chest. "That they were so painful for him." Blade frowned, clicking his tongue, waving the creature over to him. Fluffy turned clumsily on his hind legs, nudging his snout into Gushikin's hand. "I wasn't either, but even if it wasn't physically painful, it's not enjoyable for anyone to be chained down. I should have realized that sooner." Tristan understood that better than most, but he shoved the memory away before it could fully form and tear through the fortress he built to keep it at bay. "I'm satisfied that he seems to be doing better." The creature turned towards him, a deep wisdom in its slitted gaze. The villain nearly bent at the waist to bow, granting the creature the respect he was owed. But he kept his legs firm, trying to keep the reverence in his face hidden behind a facade of indifference. Instead, he turned back toward the manor's gate, unable to look at the creature a second longer, knowing he'd caused him harm. "Wait, boss, you didn't hear the best part," Blade shouted. The villain didn't turn, just halted in his tracks, keeping his back to the three of them. "When I took off the chains, I noticed something interesting engraved on the inside." The clanging of metal earned a turn of his neck, only to see the dragon tamer dragging over a large silver ring so big he needed to spread his arms to full length to carry it. Dropping it at the villain's feet, he pointed to the inside, where small letters were etched. "The villain will fall." He ran a finger over the words, his other hand a tight fist as his nails bit into his palms. Both women spied the writing and gasped. Sage crouched low beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm and immediately settling his rising magic. "We had the chains in storage before Blade even arrived. Someone signed off on a crate of weapons and equipment being delivered, and this was in it. They came in a shipment we lifted off King Benedict's trade with Grenoa, the kingdom to the east. It was my first week here." Something was nagging at him, some point he was missing, but the links of this twisted mystery refused to untangle themselves. It seemed they kept coming to loose ends with no real answers, and still an agent of his worst enemy was somewhere in this castle, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He'd known that King Benedict was behind the attacks. After all, the king was the one who begun this little war between them. But though Benedict may have launched the ships, Tristan was the one who fired the first cannon, and he'd do it again. It was the villain's job, after all. Benedict knew this was coming to me. He knew Blade would take the dragon, had this made and brought in by his traitor. He kicked the chains, a flare of anger driving his power to the edges of the courtyard, his magic searching for any weakness to claim, to kill. "He's playing with me." His voice was hard and cold as he added, "But I will win this game. Get his head on a spit." And with that, he strode to the castle gate once more, dark purpose in every footfall. He hoped Benedict was comfortable with the meager advantages he'd collected this far, because this string of victories was about to come to an abrupt halt. Rubbing his neck, feeling his own chains tighten there, the villain smiled. He'd evaporate every chance of hope Benedict and any of his supporters had, watch them run for their miserable lives as he descended death upon them. Benedict had been the first person to look upon Tristan's face and call him a monster, and it was to be his life's greatest pleasure to remind the king exactly what that meant. Time. I think we will call it there. We read 5 chapters. I'm going to call it. Wait, I'm going to turn the mic off. Why did I do that? We're going to do catbacks. God damn it. What is wrong with me?